Imagine this. You are Livia Marcella, barely 13 years old, standing in a torchlit chamber in Rome on a summer night in 68 before Christ. The scent of incense burns your nostrils as your mother and aunts strip away your wedding garments. Their hands are not gentle. Outside the carved doors, you hear men laughing, your new husband Marcus among them. A man of 32 who inspected your teeth like a horse before agreeing to the marriage. But what terrifies you most is the elderly woman approaching with oil-slicked fingers, the pronuba, whose job is to prepare your body for what comes next. She is here to ensure the marriage can be consummated, and her methods will leave you trembling long after this night ends. This is not a tale of romantic wedding nights. This is the brutal reality of Roman marriage customs, where the most intimate moments became public spectacles and legal requirements. What you are about to discover will shatter every romanticized notion about ancient Rome. The marble temples, concealed practices so invasive that they make modern traditions seem like paradise. The Roman wedding night was never private. From the moment the contract was signed, a bride's body became legal property, and consummation required verification by witnesses. In 11 before Christ, when Julia, daughter of Emperor Augustus, married Tiberius, the testatio ceremony demanded that representatives from both families position themselves outside the wedding chamber. These were not symbolic observers. They pressed ears to doors, listening for specific sounds indicating successful penetration. The creaking of bed frames in proper rhythm. The bride's cries of pain, proof of virginity being taken. The groom's satisfied exclamations marking completion. Inside that chamber, Julia endured what every Roman bride experienced. The pronuba had already performed her duties, a role combining midwife and enforcer. This appointed matron, always a woman married only once to ensure good fortune, had legal authority to inspect the bride's body before the groom entered. Her oil-slicked fingers checked for the intact hymen, probing with clinical efficiency. Any resistance was firmly suppressed. The pronuba's verification was legal requirement. If she reported the bride was not a virgin, the marriage could be annulled immediately, the dowry forfeited, and the girl's family disgraced throughout Rome. But the pronuba's duties extended beyond inspection. She prepared the bride physically for penetration, stretching the opening with oil and wooden implements if necessary. Roman medical texts, including those of Soranus writing in the 1st century, describe these preparations as essential to prevent the bride being damaged beyond use. Brides were objects to be prepared for function, not humans entering a shared experience. The pronuba worked with the efficiency of someone preparing a temple sacrifice. The morning after brought its own humiliation. The bride's mother and female relatives would enter the chamber at dawn to inspect bedsheets. They searched for blood, proof of virginity taken, and marriage consummated. In patrician families, these sheets were displayed to assembled guests during the morning wedding feast. Servants carried them through the dining hall while men raised cups. The bloodstain became a trophy, evidence that the groom had successfully claimed his legal property. Plutarch describes this practice matter-of-factly, noting it prevented future disputes. What he does not mention is the teenage girl forced to sit through breakfast while strangers toasted over evidence of her pain. The fertility rituals that preceded consummation revealed Rome's obsession with ensuring procreation through invasive means. When the bride arrived at her new home, she found the marriage bed prepared according to ancient custom. The bed frame had been anointed with sheep's blood, symbolizing the coming defloration. The pillows contained fascinum amulets, small replicas of erect phalluses made of bronze. These were not merely symbolic. Roman belief held that Priapus, deity of fertility, would inhabit these objects and assist in defloration if the groom proved inadequate. Catullus, the poet who wrote extensively about marriage customs in the 1st century before Christ, describes what happened when a groom hesitated or failed to complete the act quickly. The attending matrons, still present in the chamber, would retrieve a larger Priapus statue kept for this purpose. The groom would be ordered aside while these women used the carved wooden phallus to break the hymen themselves, chanting prayers to ensure fertility. The bride had no say. Her consent was irrelevant because her body was now her husband's legal property. Records from Pompeii show many wealthy homes maintained dedicated rooms for wedding ceremonies, complete with wall paintings depicting Priapus overseeing floration. This was standard practice displayed proudly in frescoes that guests would admire. The ritual application of oils reveals even more disturbing details. Ovid's Ars Amatoria includes a section advising grooms on wedding night technique. But before the groom's technique mattered, the pronuba and assistants performed preparatory work. They applied heated oils extracted from plants and animal fats, substances believed to make penetration easier. The application was not gentle. The bride was positioned on the marriage bed while multiple women held her legs apart. The pronuba inserted oil-coated fingers repeatedly, working to stretch the opening, while other attendants restrained the girl if she struggled. They spoke throughout this violation, offering advice to the watching groom about how much force to apply, which angle would be most effective, and how to recognize when he had torn through completely. What makes this even more grotesque is that the ritual was considered kindness. The matrons truly believed they were helping by pre-stretching, preventing worse damage when the husband took his turn. Soranus's medical texts explain the logic with chilling clarity. A bride properly prepared could be used frequently without developing tears that might become infected. An unprepared bride might suffer damage requiring weeks of healing. The bride's comfort never entered the equation. Her body was property needing to function properly, and the pronuba's invasive preparations were maintenance before the owner took possession. Now that you have witnessed the public verification and invasive preparations that preceded Roman wedding nights, you are beginning to see patterns hidden beneath civilization's marble facade. The systematic nature of these violations reveals how power structures operate when unchecked by any concept of personal autonomy. If uncovering these buried truths about ancient practices resonates with your curiosity about how societies really functioned behind glorious facades, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into history's most guarded secrets. The stories waiting ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about supposedly enlightened cultures. Because what comes next, the legal frameworks that transform these horrors from customs into requirements, will show you that Rome did not simply tolerate this treatment of brides. Roman law demanded it. The legal obligations surrounding Roman marriage consummation created a framework of coercion that left brides with no recourse. Under laws codified during Emperor Hadrian's reign from 117 to 138, a marriage was not legally valid until consummation occurred. Unconsummated marriages could be annulled by either family, resulting in the bride's return to her father's household in disgrace, forfeiture of the dowry, and permanent destruction of marriage prospects. But the law imposed an even more terrifying timeline. Consummation had to occur within 3 nights of the ceremony, or the contract became voidable at the husband's discretion. This 3-night rule created impossible pressure on young brides already traumatized. If the first night failed due to the groom's impotence or the bride's body being too damaged by preparatory procedures, 2 more attempts were required. Each night brought the same witnesses, examinations, invasive attentions. Justinian's Digest, the compilation of Roman legal precedents completed in 533, contains dozens of cases debating what constituted successful consummation. Did penetration alone suffice, or was a mission required? If the bride bled during the first attempt, but the groom failed to complete, did that count? These legal debates treated terrified teenage girls as problems to solve through jurisprudence rather than human beings enduring systematic assault. The husband's legal rights during this 3-night window were absolute. Roman law explicitly granted him authority to use whatever force necessary to complete the act. If the bride resisted, he could summon male slaves to physically restrain her while he penetrated her. If she screamed too loudly, he could have her gagged. If she clenched too tightly, the pronuba would be summoned to forcibly relax muscles. All of this was not merely permitted, but legally protected. A bride who prevented consummation through resistance could be charged with violating her marriage contract, allowing her husband to keep the dowry while returning her as damaged goods. The bride's family had rights too, but these offered no protection. In cases where the groom appeared to be failing, the bride's father or brothers could legally demand to observe proceedings to ensure proper effort. Seneca describes a case where a bride's family suspected the groom of impotence. They insisted on entering the chamber during the 3rd night, positioning themselves at the bed's foot to watch and verify penetration was truly occurring. The letter records the groom's outrage, but the court sided with the bride's family. Their financial investment entitled them to ensure proper consummation. The bride's trauma at being penetrated while her father and brothers watched was never mentioned. Failed consummation brought catastrophic consequences. Her younger sister's marriage prospects evaporated because families feared the same failure might run in the bloodline. Her father's business relationships suffered. Most devastating was the bride herself, now labeled as either defective goods, if failure was blamed on her body, or damaged by contact with an impotent man. Either way, her life was functionally over. No respectable man would marry her, leaving her dependent on family charity or facing a future in Rome's brothels. The systematic nature of this coercion reveals something crucial. This was not individual cruel men acting outside norms. This was the law itself, backed by centuries of legal precedent, supported by religious authority, enforced by an entire society viewing young girls as property whose primary value lay in producing legitimate heirs. The 3-night rule, witness requirements, legal protections for force, all formed a comprehensive system designed to ensure purchased brides could not escape their function. But here is where the nightmare becomes truly unbearable. All of these customs were applied to children. The standard marriage age for Roman girls hovered between 12 and 14, with 12 considered ideal because doctors believed younger girls were more easily stretched and trained. When Octavia married the future Emperor Nero in 53, she was 11 years old. Her husband was 16. The wedding night proceeded exactly as law and custom required, complete with witnesses, examination, and forced consummation of a child whose body had barely begun puberty. Tacitus records the political importance of Octavia's marriage in his annals, noting the alliance it created. What he mentions only in passing is that the pronuba reported significant difficulty preparing Octavia's body, requiring extended time and progressively larger implements to create an opening sufficient for penetration. The girl's screams during preparation were interpreted as modesty rather than agony. When Nero finally entered the chamber, witnesses reported consummation took considerable time and required physical assistance from two matrons who held Octavia's legs apart. The sheet inspection showed extensive bleeding requiring physician attention. Octavia survived this wedding night, but she would spend her brief life until Nero had her executed at age 20, suffering the consequences of systematic childhood sexual assault, legally defined as marriage. The medical understanding of the era made treatment of child brides even more deliberate. Soranus of Ephesus, whose gynecology texts were authoritative throughout the empire, provided explicit instructions for wedding nights involving girls who had not yet begun menstruation. He recommended the husband proceed slowly over multiple nights, penetrating only partially at first to allow the girl's body to accommodate gradually. This sounds almost humane until you read his reasoning. Soranus was concerned about tearing girls so badly they could not heal properly for future pregnancies, not about trauma of forcing penetration on children. His instructions treat prepubescent brides as delicate objects requiring careful breaking in. Pliny the Younger's letters reveal how Rome's educated classes viewed child bride wedding nights. He describes visiting a friend whose 12-year-old daughter had just married a senator in his 40s. Pliny arrived the morning after to find the household celebrating, but the bride herself confined to bed under physician care for severe bleeding and shock. Pliny's letter expresses mild concern that the husband might have been too vigorous, potentially damaging the girl beyond immediate use. His solution was recommending the husband wait a full week before attempting relations again. The idea that this child had been raped and required protection never enters his consideration. The training process for child brides involved systematic preparation amounting to grooming. Older female relatives instructed girls as young as 10 on what to expect and how to endure. These lessons were explicit instructions on how to position the body to minimize tearing, how to breathe through pain, and most importantly, how to fake pleasure convincingly enough to satisfy the husband. Girls practiced assuming proper positions, learning to keep legs spread without being told, to arch the back at correct angle, to make sounds indicating enjoyment rather than agony. This training occurred over months, with older women checking progress and critiquing performance. Some families employed physicians to gradually stretch young girls before marriage to increase their value. These procedures involved inserting progressively larger wooden or bronze implements over weeks or months. The stated goal was preventing wedding night tearing, but the practice also served to habituate girls to penetration before the marriage contract was even signed. Girls who underwent this preparation commanded higher dowries because grooms knew they could be used immediately without risk of damage. The girls had no choice. Their fathers decided based on cold calculation of which preparation would yield the best marriage prospects. The acceptance of child bride wedding nights as normal reveals how completely Roman society had subordinated one half of humanity to the other. Every Roman woman had endured this experience. Every Roman mother had prepared her own daughters for it. Every Roman matron had served as pronuba, performing invasive examinations on terrified girls. The system perpetuated itself because those who survived had no framework for recognizing it as wrong. They believed they were teaching girls necessary endurance, preparing them for reality of womanhood. The trauma was simply what happened when children became wives, as natural as any other life transition. But the absolute peak of Roman wedding night depravity occurred when emperors transformed private violations into public spectacles. When Caligula married his fourth wife Caesonia in 39, he did not retire to a private chamber. Instead, he ordered a public ceremony in the imperial palace's main reception hall. Senators and wives, foreign ambassadors, military commanders, and court officials were required to attend as the emperor demonstrated his virility before assembled elite. Suetonius describes the scene with detail of an eyewitness account. Caesonia was positioned on a raised platform visible to hundreds of assembled guests, while Caligula removed her wedding garments. When she stood completely naked before the crowd, he ordered her to assume proper position for penetration. She complied because refusing an emperor meant death. Caligula then penetrated her publicly while providing running commentary for the audience. He described the sensation in explicit detail, solicited advice from watching senators on technique, and demanded they rate his performance. Those who failed to show sufficient enthusiasm found themselves marked for future punishment. After completing the act, Caligula required that each male senator approach the platform to inspect proof of consummation. The humiliation belonged not just to Caesonia, but to every person forced to participate. This was not isolated imperial madness, but the beginning of a trend other emperors would adopt. Nero developed an even more elaborate version. He would stage defloration performances, where virgin brides from noble families were married in mass ceremonies to grooms selected by the emperor. After weddings concluded, consummations occurred simultaneously in the palace's great hall, while Nero circulated among couples, offering advice, criticizing technique, and sometimes participating himself when he found a particular bride appealing. Cassius Dio's Roman history records these performances could involve 20 or 30 couples at once, turning wedding nights into theatrical productions. Nero introduced another innovation that spread among Rome's wealthy elite. He required that virgin brides be tested by professional examiners before the wedding ceremony. But these examiners were not discreet pronubi. They were gladiators or well-endowed slaves who penetrated girls publicly, while physicians watched and documented findings. Nero claimed this prevented fraud by ensuring brides were truly virgins. In reality, it was another avenue for the emperor to witness and cause suffering. Girls who passed were married as planned. Those who did not were sold to brothels. Emperor Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 198, took the practice to its ultimate extreme. He required that all patrician brides in Rome be brought to the imperial palace before their weddings for preparation ceremonies. These preparations involved being used by Commodus himself, often while the groom-to-be was forced to watch. Commodus claimed he was blessing marriages with divine favor, as emperors by this time were worshipped as living gods. The grooms had no recourse. Refusing meant losing imperial favor, professional ruin, and potential execution. So they brought their betrothed to the palace and waited outside while their future wives were assaulted by the most powerful man in the world. When girls emerged, traumatized and used, weddings proceeded as planned. The spread of these practices beyond the imperial household reveals how completely Rome's elite had abandoned moral limits on power. Wealthy Romans began staging their own wedding night entertainments, inviting guests to watch consummations or participate in group ceremonies where multiple couples married and mated simultaneously. Juvenal's satires described dinner parties where the main entertainment consisted of watching newly married couples consummate their unions, while guests made wagers. These were not outcasts, but respected citizens, men who held public office and claimed to embody Roman virtue. What makes this era particularly significant is the documentation. Earlier customs left limited written records because they were too normal to require detailed description, but imperial excesses were documented extensively by historians who recognized them as extraordinary even by Roman standards. Their writings preserve details showing exactly how far human cruelty can extend when power is absolute, and cultural norms already accept systematic violation as standard practice. The emperors did not invent wedding night horrors. They simply removed the final veneer of privacy that had made earlier violations easier for society to ignore. The testimony of survivors exists only in fragments. Cassia Cornelia, a noblewoman whose diary excerpts survived in quotations by later writers, described being presented to Commodus 3 days before her scheduled wedding in 189. Her account describes the emperor's chamber in detail. The physicians present. The examination table where she was positioned. The emperor's words, as he claimed his divine right to be first to use any Roman bride of noble birth. Her description stops abruptly, replaced by a terse statement that she married as planned 2 days later. What occurred in that gap speaks louder than explicit detail. She survived, she married, she produced required heirs. But the diary fragments show a woman broken by an experience no legal or religious framework in Rome offered her any way to name as wrong. The final horror is not what these emperors did, but how Rome responded. Caligula was eventually assassinated, but not because of his wedding night spectacles. His death came from political conspiracy by senators who felt personally threatened, not from moral outrage over treatment of brides. Nero's public defloration ceremonies were mentioned in the list of his crimes when the Senate declared him a public enemy. But they appeared near the bottom, less important than his artistic pretensions. Commodus was strangled after 12 years of rule, killed in a palace plot over political power, not over systematic assault of patrician brides. None faced consequences, specifically for sexual violence. Rome tolerated that part. You came into this story thinking Roman civilization represented sophisticated ancient culture. And now you leave understanding the systematic horror that lurked behind every marble column. This transformation of perspective is exactly why these hidden histories matter. The uncomfortable truth about supposedly enlightened ancient societies deserves attention precisely because it challenges our assumptions about progress. If this journey into Rome's darkest marital practices has awakened your appetite for historical truth that textbooks sanitize, subscribing means you'll continue accessing revelations about how power really operated in the ancient world. While others celebrate Rome's engineering marvels and legal innovations, you'll know what happened in those wedding chambers and why every aspect of Roman law worked to ensure it could continue without consequence. The legacy of Roman wedding night customs extended far beyond the empire's collapse. Byzantine law preserved many of the same requirements. Medieval European marriage customs borrowed the pronuba role and sheet inspection traditions directly from Roman practice. The legal principle that wives were property influenced Western law for 1,500 years after Rome fell. We are not as far removed from these practices as we imagine. The age of consent being 12 persisted in much of Europe until the late 19th century. Marital rape was not recognized as legally possible in most Western nations until the 1970s. The concept that brides could refuse consummation with legal protection only emerged in the last 50 years. What Rome reveals about human nature is more disturbing than the specific practices themselves. An entire civilization celebrated for philosophy, engineering, law, and culture built its foundation on the systematic sexual exploitation of children and young women. This was not hidden shame. It was open legal and defended by the society's greatest minds as necessary for social order. The disconnect between Rome's cultural achievements and moral blindness shows how easily humans rationalize evil when it serves their interest. The temptation exists to view Roman wedding night customs as simply products of their time. This is exactly the wrong lesson. Rome shows us how quickly societies normalize violence when it is systematically organized, legally protected, and culturally celebrated. The customs began as practical responses to specific needs around inheritance. They evolved into elaborate rituals that served no purpose except demonstrating power. By the imperial era, they had become entertainment for the elite, spectacles that existed purely to humiliate. This escalation pattern appears throughout human history whenever power concentrates without restraint. The most profound lesson is about silence and complicity. Thousands of Roman men witnessed wedding night violations and said nothing. Thousands of Roman women performed invasive preparations on terrified girls and believed they were helping. Millions of Romans across centuries accepted this treatment as normal, necessary, and even sacred. Within Roman society, from slaves to senators, the practices continued because everyone participated in maintaining them. Breaking such systems requires people willing to name violence as wrong even when their entire society insists it is right. We remember Rome for roads, aqueducts, legal codes, and military conquests. We celebrate Latin literature and study Roman philosophy. We name governmental institutions after Roman models. But we forget what Roman civilization actually meant for half its population. The marble temples were built with taxes paid by families selling daughters into systematic exploitation. The literature was written by men who owned child brides. The legal innovations codified frameworks for violence. None of Rome's achievements exist separately from the horror of how it treated brides. The wedding chamber, where young Livia Marcella stood 13 centuries ago, is long since dust. The witnesses are forgotten. The pronuba who prepared her body left no name behind. But the system they served survived in various forms for over 1,000 years, and its influence persists in assumptions we still hold about marriage, consent, and power dynamics. The histories we tell ourselves about the past matter because they shape what we notice about the present. Sanitizing Rome's treatment of brides allows us to ignore how recently similar practices ended in our own societies and how easily they could return if legal and cultural frameworks protecting autonomy erode. This is history that textbooks won't teach because it forces us to confront how much evil humans can normalize. But it is exactly the history we need to understand.